Good afternoon. I'm Brian Hester, member of the Instruction Committee meeting. Before we get started, Mrs. White has requested to participate in the meeting remotely for a personal reason, specifically due to issues with child care in her location in Winchester, Virginia.
Mr. Hester, I'd like to make a motion to allow Ms. White to join electronically.
I will second that. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Mrs. White, are you there?
Oh, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
There you go. How are you, Mrs. White?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for being flexible.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so we do have an agenda in front of us. Dr. Hummer, are there any changes that need to be made to the agenda before it gets approved?
No, Mr. Chair.
Okay, with that said, how would the board like to move forward with the agenda?
I'd like to make a motion to accept the agenda as presented.
I will second that. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion passes. With that, we will move on to new business. Dr. Hummer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we have a couple items on the agenda for this evening. With one of them, we are recommending to go to the full board for action. We have a data review for our school accreditation report, so we're going to share with you where we're at with our current academic progress for our students. We also have a student discipline update where we are going to talk about some numbers in regards to where we are with some discipline infractions, as well as the new process. That is, it was a new process that went into effect about 3 years ago. We want to make sure that the board and the public are up to speed in regards to what that entails, as well as some other things we're going to be working on. So Mr. Boland's going to be sharing that information with us. We also have Dr. Greathouse here, who's going to be sharing with you the Gifted Advisory Committee annual report. So very excited about that information. We are also going to provide you with just a brief update of where we are with the 24, 25, 25, 26 calendar committee update in regards to where we're at with that, next steps. And then the one item that will need to go to the full board for approval is we have an update to the program of studies where Dr. Angelo and his team will be presenting that information to you as well. So that's where we're at, Mr. Chair. I'm now going to hand it over to Dr. Angelo. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Dr. Hummer. Madam Chair, members of the committee, Dr. Hummer has run through our agenda for the afternoon. Before I turn it over to Mrs. Swager, I do want to just make, sort of provide a little bit of a context, because what we're presenting to you is data that is based on accreditation. And so I want to differentiate that, because people will sometimes look at the VDOE website and our school report card and say, wait a minute, that's not the data that you present. What are you hiding? We're not hiding anything, but we really focus on our accreditation, our accreditation levels and our accreditation data. And that includes some pieces of assessment that isn't included in the school quality profile that's on the VDOE website. So our scores that we're going to share with you today are a little bit higher than what you're going to see if you go on VDOE. Anybody is free to go on VDOE. Those are raw scores prior to retests or growth measures or those types of things. So I just want to be very, very clear that we're not trying to scoot under the radar and say, no, you know, we're doing fine. We know we have some areas to focus on, and we'll share those with you. But there will be a gap. So I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that. All right, I will ask Mrs. Swager to come up, and she will share the elementary level accreditation data.
Good afternoon, members of the board, Dr. Hummer. Before we start talking about the data for elementary students, I wanted to just take a moment to have you think back to where our students have been, because it's important to think about the story and what our students have been through as we think about where they are right now in the course of their schooling and their achievement or for our accreditation data. So the students that we will be talking about as far as the achievement data for the 22-23 school year, or spring of 23, were third grade, fourth grade, and fifth grade students. They are 8, 9, and 10 years old, and their schooling has not been like the schooling that any other elementary students have ever been through. Because if you look at the chart that's in front of you, from kindergarten to third grade, or first to fourth, or second to fifth grade, their schooling was interrupted. And so where you see the word lost, that means that they lost that much face-to-face time with their teachers. They were not in front of their teachers for the entire school year or for every day during the school year. For quarantine, that means that that was a year when the students were being quarantined at least 10 days if they were sick or suspected to be sick with COVID. And so, or if anyone in their family was sick. And so it was the year where a student might get sick, but then the student was not only quarantined for their own illness, they were quarantined for all the other members in the family who then subsequently got sick. So it's just important for us to remember that as we look at our results and think about the students who were being measured last year in 2023 with their assessment scores for SOLs. So as far as elementary highlights, all of our schools are accredited at the elementary level. 11 of them are fully accredited. 1 is accredited with conditions. 82% of our schools have an 82% pass rate for English, which is reading and language arts included in that. And then 80% have we have an 80% pass rate for mathematics at the elementary level. One highlight is that our English language learners are outperforming all students. And I think sometimes we don't expect that or we don't anticipate that, but our data shows that our students who are identified as English language learners in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade are doing remarkably well considering that, that barrier of language. And our growth rates, which we'll talk about in a little bit here, have significantly increased in English for our elementary students. So we do have a lot to celebrate at the elementary level. You can see here the results that we have for our English or reading assessments for the last 3 testing years. And there's that gap there because in spring of 2020, there were no SOL assessments. And in spring of 2021, we didn't have results from the assessments from that year either because of COVID impact. So that's why there's that gap there from spring of 19 to spring of 22. But you can see from the spring of 2019 until the spring of 23, we do still have gains, even though you can see some fluctuation across the board there. And so while we performed a little bit better last year in the spring of 2022, we still are performing better at this point than we were in the spring of 2019, which was actually prior to COVID. So even with the impact of COVID, our students are performing better than they were in 2019. Related to English or reading at the elementary level. Our economically disadvantaged students continue to perform behind their overall peer group of all students. But as you see there, our ELL students are performing much better, as it's a smaller group of students certainly, but they are performing better than the group of all students are performing. And our students with disabilities continue to lag behind. And so that's an area that we continue to focus on. For mathematics, you can see the same thing here as far as spring of 2019, and then there's that gap until spring of 22 and spring of 23. And so while we are not performing as well as we were performing in the spring of 2019 with mathematics, we're finding that's kind of a trend across the state. And one of the things that they've talked about at the state with, in the mathematics department and with the calls that we participate in with other schools, it seems that the gap in mathematics hasn't rebounded quite as quickly as in other areas. And part of the conjecture, perhaps, is that that gap in conceptual understanding may be problematic. And so while with reading, if there's a gap, sometimes you can overcome that or kind of cover it up a little bit better, so to speak, as you go along, and students learn how to compensate for that differently. Whereas in mathematics, sometimes that gap exists, but it doesn't show up until later on when you get into some of the higher mathematics, and then that conceptual understanding is missing. And so sometimes we think that they have what they need, and then they get to a grade level where the mathematics is more difficult, and all of a sudden kind of the floor kind of drops out from underneath them because they didn't have that learning. So we're working on focusing on trying to identify and close those gaps. But that, like I said, that's a trend that seems to be happening across the state. And once again, you can see that our economically disadvantaged and students with disabilities are performing behind their overall peer group. But our ELL students continue to perform better in most cases than our overall group of students do, even with mathematics. In science, we have had a significant drop in achievement since the spring of 2019. We attribute a lot of that to the fact that during COVID, and as we were trying to pull out of the impacts of COVID, we were focused on reading and mathematics. And when students were in school 50% of the time, when we didn't have them face-to-face as much as we wanted them there face-to-face, when we did have them, we were teaching reading and mathematics at the elementary level. And so while we were integrating science and social studies as much as possible into those other content areas, there wasn't as much direct instruction happening. And so we are still working to get that science content back up to where it needs to be, and are focused on efforts to improve that across the board in all of our schools, and then in schools where they are really struggling with science.
And science is such a hands-on, you know, it makes it hard when you don't have that ability to, you know, do the science projects and things like that. So.
Right, it's really hard to do a science experiment virtually.
Exactly.
With students. And so the results show that we had increased growth rates as well, and this was something that I mentioned a little bit earlier. You can see in both reading and mathematics, we had large jumps in the percentage of our students who showed growth. And that means that they went from, they kind of separated into 4 quadrants. And so you're proficient or low proficient or high proficient. And I think below proficient is the lowest one. And if you move from one quadrant to the other, then it's considered that you've made growth. And so that means that in the spring of 23, 43% of our students showed growth by performing better, at least by 1 quadrant in reading, and 40% of our students did that in mathematics. So that's a good positive gain, and it shows that even though some of those students may not have ultimately passed their standards of learning test in those content areas, they were making growth, and they were moving toward the goal in the way that we would want them to. So we will continue to focus on working with all of our teachers so that our students with disabilities and our economically disadvantaged students don't continue to lag behind their peers. We have a strong focus at the elementary level on Tier 1 instruction that is scaffolded or differentiated to meet the needs of students, but so that it remains grade level material that students can access and may learn differently, but they're still getting that grade level material. We are working to make sure that the rigor and depth of instruction, especially in mathematics, is being met. This is a large emphasis in the new standards that have just been approved, and that we will be responsible for teaching at the start of next school year, and that our teachers are already delving into. And so we're trying to make sure that we're getting after those conceptual understandings and the foundational mathematics instruction that needs to occur for all students. Our reading instruction is based on evidence-based literacy practices, and our teachers are receiving a lot of professional learning related to that, so that our students are getting the foundational learning that they need in reading. And we are focused on students doing science. And so, as Mr. Hester said, you know, the involvement of students and the engagement of students in the action of actually experiencing science is really important. And so we're trying to make sure in all of our classrooms that that is happening, and finding ways for our teachers to build that into their instruction on a regular basis, so that students have experiences where they are thinking and writing and observing, and vocabulary is being used naturally, but they are being expected to use scientific vocabulary and understand what that means as they use it and apply it. And so that concludes the portion that I have on elementary. If there are any questions that you have.
Mr. Atkins?
Ms. Swigert, as far as the credit, you mentioned one of the elementary schools had accreditation with conditions. What are those conditions, and how are we focusing to meet those conditions?
Well, that's a really good question, because the Office of School Quality just, last week, Dr. Angelo, released information indicating that some of the things that schools would be required to do or go through are changing, and that they are going to be giving us more information in the coming weeks. So we aren't 100% sure what all of those things are that schools would have to do, but for instance, it often includes an academic review, it includes an essential action plan that schools do, and they embed that into their continuous school improvement process. there are certain benchmarks that they have to meet or that they need to work toward in professional learning that they're providing for teachers related to the content area. And in this case, it was science. And so we have things already built in that school has been working on related to science instruction.
And then one final question. I know this is kind of something that we haven't really focused or had brought before us before with a pandemic. So it's kind of unprecedented. Typically, though, what would the timeline be to see those scores start coming back up amongst all these grade levels?
You mean is because of the pandemic?
I understand because of the pandemic we had the dip. To get back on track, what's our timeline to get there?
We are trying to make that timeline as soon as possible. The unknown factor are the other things that kids are dealing with and what we need to do differently with every child. So every child is in a unique situation, and it's difficult to say that we can get every child to a certain place by a certain point in time. Our goal certainly is to get students where they need to be and on grade level and on track as quickly as possible. I think it's just difficult to put an actual timeline on that other than we're working to get there as soon as we can.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may, Mr. Atkins, I think that is a fantastic question because we've been asking that question for the past 3 years now. I think one piece that we cannot fail to recognize is that, yes, we're focusing on the impact that this had on students, but we cannot forget the impact that this had on our families and also the impact that it had on our staff. We are in a shortage, and that shortage was amplified because of this pandemic. We are working extremely hard to fill these positions and get the right staff in front of our students, but unfortunately we are dealing with, as Mrs. Frackley has been providing us with numerous updates on our staff, and our principals will share with us, we're struggling to find these people to fill these positions. So we're working with universities. We're trying to think outside the box and creatively on incentives, which we'll be prepared to share with you all. But I say all that to say, great question, but I think there are so many variables to that until all those variables work itself out, we're going to continuously to see, and I'm going to stay optimistic to see that growth, but there's a bigger piece to this than just students performing on assessments, because there's a lot of aspects to that. So great question.
Well, I understand that, Dr. Hummer, but I hear parents in the community say, when will my child be back on grade level? And I mean, that's where that question's coming from. I think the parents out there would like to know, our efforts, and I see that you've prepared that in the presentation, but, when are we going to get there? And I understand we're trying to get there as fast as possible. I know that's our goal. Just like a realistic timeline, is this going to be something where it's going to take a few years to get everybody up? Do we have to integrate more programs in there? Do we have to change our curriculum to maybe break something down so that people can get caught back up? It's just, one of those lingering questions from the pandemic that we still have.
Yeah, agreed.
I've got a question, but I'm going to preface my question by saying I don't like to use the phrase students with disabilities, because you've heard me say before, I think we all have something we can work on, and it's just the way my mind thinks. But since that is a demographic, when it comes to the testing and, these figures for students with disabilities, is that the entire group that is identified as having something like a 504 plan, or does it constitute just a small percentage of?
I was just going to say, Dr. Sandy, would you like to answer that question?
Because, I think we've talked in previous meetings, over the course of years, the students with disabilities group has been going up. And so I just sort of wanted to see what type of, percentage of our student population is being identified as students with disabilities for testing purposes.
So we have about 14% of our students are students with disabilities.
Okay.
I would also remind you that within students with disabilities, there are 13 different disabling conditions.
Yep.
And that varies from very mild impact to significant impact. And so when we look at that overall, and then of course you throw in the students who are eligible under Section 504, those are really accommodations to level the playing field for those students. What we are doing for our students with disabilities is obviously varying their instruction based on their individualized educational program. We want to ensure that they have time with their peers. We want to make sure that our teachers are honing in on the craft of specially designed instruction to support them. And we're partnering with Gen Ed so that we can make sure that their needs are being met in whatever classroom they're receiving their instruction. I don't know if that answers all of it, but it's about 14%, and it really does vary based on the student. There are accommodations that are allowable for students with disabilities. There are some that they have to meet the state criteria in order to use those. For example, to use read aloud accommodation for some of our students, there's very specific criteria. The IP team has to consider that, and the child either meets it or does not meet it. And so they would have to be assessed, reading it on their own when their grade level may be below that of their peers, but using some of those strategies that are taught in the classroom to help support them.
So students with disabilities, they're tested appropriately? Or they're not taking the same tests?
They are taking the exact same test as our grade level
That's what,
students.
where I was getting.
Unless they qualify for
Oh.
the VAP,
Correct.
which is 1%, should be 1% of our population of students, which is students with significant cognitive needs, which would count towards a pass rate.
Yeah. That's where I was getting at. So they're taking the same
They are,
exact,
absolutely.
they're taking the same exact test. And that can be truly difficult
For
depending
example,
on.
I'm third grade, Jerry's in third grade. I may have significant decoding problems and require instruction in that. She could be reading close to grade level. We are expected to take the exact same test, and the threshold for passing that is the exact same.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so, in my opinion, I know it's been said they're lagging a little bit, but in my opinion, they're doing great. I mean, it's one of those things where it's hard to, you know, and talking from individual, personal, you know, a student might get to a point in their life, and I'm talking from personal experience, that it's just who they are. You know, they have a learning capability of a certain grade level, even though they might be older or whatever, and they're expected to take the same tests as somebody else. It can be very tricky and very hard, even though they're trying to do their best. So.
And I would just add that this is one small portion of the child.
Exactly.
I mean, you were all in the instructional committee last month. You heard from our students who were here. You heard Jalen speak, who is a child with a disability, and how great he's doing. I would never want us to define our students with disabilities by a number,
Yeah.
because they're more than that.
Yes, so much. Thank you. Mrs. White, did you have any questions?
I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I will share the secondary school highlights. That would be middle school and high school, grades 6 through 12. All of our schools are accredited. 6 are fully accredited. 1 is accredited with conditions. And before you ask the question, I will just answer it. The one that is accredited with conditions is a middle school, Frederick County Middle School, and it is for English for Hispanic students, students with disabilities and economically disadvantaged, and for science. So those are the 2 areas that are focus areas for Frederick County Middle School.
Thank you.
A highlight, we have a 90% pass rate for English at the high school level, 82% pass rate for math at the high school level. Those are reasonably good numbers considering where we are right now. Again, our EL students are outperforming their peers in mathematics at both the middle and high school level, which is very impressive. And there are scores for certain reporting groups that are generally higher now than they were pre-pandemic in 2019. So all positive things. Not to say we don't have work to do, because we do, which we'll get into right now. So you'll notice that when we're talking highlights, most of those are focused on high school. Our middle schools are certainly struggling to close that gap and to bring our students back to where they were pre-pandemic. And as Dr. Hummer said, it's a very complex issue that we're trying to work through. And I appreciate you mentioning staff, because in addition to students having to quarantine, staff had to quarantine too, which means that our students were not in front of their teacher consistently during those years. So that's really important to remember. We are either holding steady or declining. We're certainly not improving in the area of middle school, and that is absolutely something that we are focusing on and working through, taking a deep dive into that data and trying to understand why it is, because you'll see in a second that high school is not in this predicament. You saw that elementary school isn't in this predicament. Trying to understand, and again, it's complex issues, right? Middle school tends to perform a little lower than the other levels anyways, just because it's adolescence, it's what kids are going through. And then additionally, what Mrs. Swager mentioned were impacts of our students at the elementary level of the pandemic. These students had those same impacts at the elementary level, and now they're in high school, and they've lost some foundational skills, there's no question. And so we're working through that. We'll talk through that a little bit, but we are absolutely acknowledging and recognizing that our middle school students are not performing where they need to be. High schools, it's a little bit better of a picture. So all students are outperforming their 2019 peers. That's a positive thing. We're, as I mentioned, about 90% pass rate. Economically disadvantaged, EL, and students with disabilities are reasonably close for economically disadvantaged, and EL students are generally close to where they were in 2019. Students with disabilities have come up, but we've dipped this past spring from where we were in 2022. The middle schools, math, similar issue to elementary. Math is really struggling to bounce back following the pandemic. You can see where we were in 2019 for all students at an 87% pass rate. We're at 66, almost 67%. So continues to be a drop there, coming up a little bit for all students, but dropping for economically disadvantaged and students with disabilities for mathematics at the middle school level. And again, there's a lot of discussion as to why that's happening. I mean, probably some of this is similar to the science piece where students in math, you know, it's no longer just sitting and doing work in a book. And so when they didn't have those opportunities to work collaboratively with their peers, problem solving and bouncing ideas off of one another, those conceptual framework concepts just didn't quite get there. So we are definitely paying attention to that and focusing on that. High school level math has dipped a little bit, not quite as dramatically as it has for middle school, and still in reasonably good shape, not where we want to be for all students for sure, but we are closer than we are in middle school. Students with disabilities has remained pretty flat since 2019. Not saying that's a good thing. I'm highlighting that as an area to focus on. Science, again, for the middle school level, much like the elementary level, and it continues to drop. So we were lower this year than we were the year before. Part of that, again, is the inability of students to be able to work together during the pandemic. Keep in mind, some of these students, they would have been, I guess, in 5th grade during the shutdown, and so they lost some of those foundational skills through the years. And so, you know, these concepts, science and math in particular, they build on one another. We talk about spiraling. And so when you lose some of those pieces, you're no longer building on something that you would have learned otherwise. And so there are gaps, and those gaps, I think, is what we're seeing in these, particularly in science and math. And the other reality is that students still were reading during the pandemic. Their families were reading to them at night. There probably weren't that many students whose families were doing math with them or science with them, or, you know, giving them a math problem before they went to bed at night. You know, so some of that too, you know, these are areas that families aren't focusing on with their kids at home, but reading is something that typically families and kids will do independently even when they're not in school. And then science, again, at the high school level, similar drop. I want to talk about growth rates at the middle school level, and growth only is only counted for elementary and middle school, so you won't see growth rates in high school, just as an informational piece there. But the growth at the middle school level is not seeing that same bump that it is at the elementary level, pretty flat in English and dipped down in math. And so what this means is that not only are students not caught up with a passing score, we're not seeing sufficient growth, which means, to answer your question, Mr. Atkins, about how long this is going to take, we need to be seeing growth in our students in order to know that we're starting to come out. And this doesn't bode well, being very honest. So our area of continued focus, certainly middle school is the primary focus here. And again, just as it is the case at elementary level, where we're focusing on evidence-based reading instruction, doing the same thing at middle school. That process has lagged a little bit behind in middle school, just because middle school teachers aren't taught generally to teach reading. They're taught how to teach English. So there's a difference there. You've got writing, you've got grammar, and then you have literature and interpreting literature. So our middle school teachers, for the most part, are not elementary trained, which is where they would learn how to teach actual reading, decoding, and so forth. So we're working through that on similar skills that we've been working on at the elementary level. And Dr. Myers, who isn't here today, is why I'm here with you, is collaborating with Mrs. Swager and Dr. Sandy on that for the middle school level. Again, achievement levels continue to stagnate or decline. We need to see growth, which means we need to be formatively measuring where students are along the path and identifying those gaps in kind of immediately as they're going through and addressing those gaps. And so that's one of the things you had asked about, what are we doing about this? That's one of the things we can do, is more frequent and less comprehensive formative assessments. In other words, when I say less comprehensive, skills that they're learning now, where are you, so that it's not about remediation and reteach. It's not about remediation and going under grade level skills. It's about reteaching and solidifying their understanding of those grade level skills. And that's going to be a super critical piece. Science achievement is uncharacteristically low at all levels, and so we're certainly focused on that. And then students with disabilities. And I appreciate your comment, but in my view, it is truly unacceptable levels of achievement, and we need to do better with our students with disabilities. Nationwide, I know that there is data that shows that from a COVID perspective, students with disabilities, African American students and Hispanic students were more impacted by COVID than other students were for whatever reason. And so, we're definitely seeing probably some effects of that. So that is it for the middle and high schools. I also just want to say that you see like single scores here. I do want to be clear that this is a very high level report. These are division level scores. Our schools are looking at their own data. They look at not only overall school data, they look at classroom data, they look at individual student data, and they even drill down to, okay, we call it student data by question. What are the most frequently missed questions? And is it happening broadly, or is it happening just with a narrow group of students? So that we can say, okay, so a lot of students miss this concept, so that's an area we need to focus on and shore up that instruction and those learning experiences for our kids. So hopefully that answered some of your previous questions about how we're addressing this. We are not waiting to be told from the state what to do. We know what to do. We're doing it.
Good deal. Yeah, Dr. Angel, I couldn't agree with you more on that frequent testing, not just to test kids, but for data points, right? That way we can make sure that nothing is slipping through the cracks, and we can address problems as they're coming along, and instead of waiting till these bigger tests come along and we have those data points where we can keep that track. So yeah. I appreciate those kind of efforts. Thank you.
Thanks.
Are students across the school system using the ability for that tutoring that how's that going?
That's a great question. So the all-in
yes.
Virginia. So we have all of our schools I mean, this is taking a while, right? So all of our schools have now provided us what their plan is. We have to take that plan and consolidate it down and submit it to first Dr. Hummer, who will review it and either approve it or give us feedback, and we'll make adjustments to it, and then we send it to the state for approval. The funds can't be spent specifically until we have them allocated to us by downtown, obviously, and so that process will happen over a course of time. However, it's not that we're not doing that. We have ESSER money, and so we will backfill with ESSER money until we have this all in Virginia money. But they have plans, they know what it is they're doing, and yes, it's grades 3 through 8 only. It doesn't count for high school. And it's roughly 80% to 85% of our students qualify for that, which is pretty typical across the state.
And if I'm not mistaken, please correct me, this is the last year for it to be funded, correct?
So the
from a state perspective,
the ESSER funds end at the end of September next year, so those run out and those go away at the end of September. The state funding can be renewed for 2 additional years. We get the same amount of money, so the allocation we have is the allocation we have. But if we agree to provide summer learning experiences for students who are considered at risk, and we sign off on that, which we do every year, we've done that every year for years, then we can carry that money over through June of 2026, which is what our plan is. Because it's a fair amount of money, and we're not spending it in the 6 months that we're gonna have to do it. So yes, it'll carry over for 2.5 years, 2 years beyond this one.
Okay. Well, I'll bring up that question in 2 years, because I think the tutoring helps.
It does.
You know, and the more resources students can have, you know, to get that extra help, you know, I think it would only benefit them. So, I mean, I'm glad, and it's good that we've got the money to provide that going through 2026.
The positive thing about this funding too and this focus is it's not, as I was mentioning a few minutes ago, it's not remediation. It can't be remediation. In other words, you can't take 6th grade student and say, okay, you're weak in 3rd grade skills, so we're gonna focus on 3rd grade skills. It is on grade level material. So we are providing tutoring based on the data that we're collecting, tutoring on grade level concepts, which is really important, and that's not something that, like the ESSER funding was really pretty well focused on closing the gaps, which means what did they miss? This is more focused on how can we keep kids moving forward rather than treading water and standing still. So we still have a little bit more, we have quite a bit more to do, I have to tell you, but I will tell you that the next instruction committee meeting, which will be, I think, at the very end of November, will be focused on, to your point, what are we doing about it? We will be focused on continuous school improvement planning. And what does that look like? And how do we decide what goals there are and what data are we looking at and how are we measuring our progress? And we'll have some principles that we'll just talk, you know, about in real life. This is what we do. This is what our team works on. This is how often we meet. This is how we are doing towards our goals.
I'd be curious to see how those data points, you know, come throughout this year, the rest of this year, and throughout next year as well. And if we could get something to kind of have a tracking on that would be great.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, and now I believe I will call up Mr. Bolin, who's going to talk to you about student discipline, go over some data and the process that's used with regard to students.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, members, Dr. Hummer. Thank you guys for having me. I will try to be brief yet informative. I was asked by Dr. Angelo to present some information to you today, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. In Frederick County and in Virginia, when we investigate or we assign a disciplinary consequence, we use what they call the SBAR protocols, Student Behavior and Administrative Response, which replaced the old system, which was called the Discipline, Crime, and Violence reporting for state reporting purposes. Frederick County did make this switch in 2021-22, and we'll talk a little bit about the differences and how you know, this process plays out on the day-to-day basis in our schools. You when students do violate our student code of conduct, administrators address it, and they have some discretion on how they handle situations. What SBAR does is it does provide administrators the tools to address violations of our student code of conduct with both disciplinary consequences, which are necessary, as well as behavioral interventions, which are the instructional side to behavior. Sometimes you can have an incident where you may just use behavioral accommodations or behavioral interventions. But we do want to pair both of our behavioral interventions and our disciplinary consequences as we move forward. SBAR does break the behavioral categories into 6 different categories. They're listed there for you. Behaviors that impede academic process, the academic process of students or others, behaviors related to the school operations, which is BSO. RB coding is relationship behaviors. These create negative relationships between 2 or more members of the school community. The 4th category is behaviors of a safety concern. These create unsafe conditions for students or staff in the building. Behaviors that endanger self or others. These are behaviors that endanger the health, safety, and welfare of either the student or others in our school community. And then we have our persistently dangerous behaviors, which these are the behaviors that are described in Virginia's unsafe school choice option policy requirement of the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015. It's very rare that we do have a PD code. In talking a little bit about some of these, so behaviors that interfere with academic progress, some of these might be excessive talking in class or off-task behaviors, being out of your seat, some of the small manageable behaviors that we do see in classrooms every single day. Behaviors that related to the school operations that interfere with the daily school operations. Some examples might be dishonesty, both just being dishonest with teachers and staff, or academic dishonesty, cheating, refusal to comply with requests of staff, dress code violations, not going to class, or being in unauthorized areas as well are some of those behaviors that fall under that coding. Relationship behaviors, again, they create negative relationships between 2 or more members of the community. Some examples of behavior that would fall into that category are bullying, maybe making sexually suggestive comments, stealing, using vulgar language, using slurs, and unwanted physical contact. Some behaviors that of a safety concern that create unsafe conditions, the BSC categories, that would be students either being in possession of or under the influence of alcohol, possessing drug paraphernalia, tobacco. Also, bullying that would be continuing after intervention would be considered into that category. Distracting bus drivers, unsafe behavior on buses, and things of that nature. Behaviors that endanger self or others. Those behaviors, again, endanger the health, safety, and welfare of our students and others in the school. That could be assault, fighting, possession of controlled substances, being under the influence of controlled substances, excuse me, and threats to both other students and staff. And then our persistently dangerous behaviors, those are very rare, but they are very significant. And those are the ones that usually will end up in front of like the Student Conduct and Support Committee. So our administrators, there are 5 levels of discipline that we use. There was a task force put together a few years ago as we were transitioning from the DCV codes to the SBAR codes, and they had put together some work. And I know we talked a lot about COVID today. COVID kind of put a stop to that. This was going on in early 2020. So we are kind of in the process of, and I know Dr. Humber's probably informed you guys about this. We're in the process now of implementing our SBAR to our student code of conduct. We have a group together that's working on that. We will have a draft to present to the Student Conduct and Support Committee of a incorporated code of conduct. December, January timeframe is what we're looking at now, and then having something to be vetted out and ready to go for as soon as possible, really. So we have 5 levels, again, 5 levels of administrator response. Level 1 are your responses that are really just intended to prevent any further behavioral issues and keep students in the school. Again, we want to pair behavioral interventions with disciplinary consequences. So some behavioral interventions in that area for level 1 might just be reteaching and modeling the desired behavior. Peer mediation sometimes to resolve conflicts could be a good behavioral intervention to use at a level 1. Student conferences, and the best ones are always, the ones you always want to start with are those phone calls home, be communicating and building those positive relationships with our families and our parents. Disciplinary consequences for level 1 responses, again, could be seat changes, loss of school privileges, detention after school, lunch detention, before school detention. And again, behaviorally, we always want to have those parents and teachers and students communicating, and administrators as well. Level 2 responses, these are, level 1, again, are your lowest level of response up to level 5, which are extremely, I don't want to say invasive, but they can be. So administrative responses at the level 2, depending on the severity of the behavior, sometimes short-term removal of the student may be appropriate for a level 2 violation. Some of the behavioral interventions that we might put in are, student conferences, teacher conferences, check-in, check-out, where we want to check in with these students every single day. As well as disciplinary side, it could be in-school suspension or in-school assistance, as we call it, up to a few days. Temporary loss of different privileges, Friday night, Saturday night school, things like that, detention before and after school are also level 2 responses. As we get into the more significant behaviors, we could get into level 3, and depending on the severity and the chronic nature of behavior and the safety concerns, sometimes level 3 behaviors do result in student short-term removal from school. Typically, for a level 3 violation, a short-term suspension of 1 to 3 days, maybe for an elementary student, 1 to 5 days for a secondary student, with a restorative circle or restorative practice as they return. Typically, what that looks like is the administrator, the student, and the parents will meet. Sometimes it can be virtual, sometimes they can actually come into the building, sit down and conference about the behavior and what the plan is moving forward. Some behavioral interventions for level 3 behaviors could be a referral through the Student Services Department for some community-based services if there are things that the school is seeing that possibly that Student Services can assist with. Behavior contracts developed by the students and the teachers in conjunction with the administration. If you are dealing with a student who requires specialized instruction, it might be appropriate to refer them to their IEP team for some behavioral interventions through the IEP team, possibly a functional behavior assessment with the development in the future of a behavior intervention plan. Level 4 behaviors, or level 4 responses, excuse me, they do require a report to the superintendent or the superintendent designee most of the time. These are the behaviors where we have safety issues usually. And typically these will result in some sort of possible suspension, whether it's in school or out of school. It could be referred to the superintendent's designee, who has made the hearing officer, for further consideration for further disciplinary action as well. And these always should involve parent, teacher, student, and behavior intervention meetings. A lot of times they do require referrals to community-based services through our Student Services Department, as well as threat assessments to be conducted at that time. Your level 5 responses, these are the significant issues when we're dealing with persistently dangerous behaviors. In level 5, oh yeah, I'm not doing a very good job with that. Apologize. Typically, any level 5 violation is going to come to my office, and we're going to address that through a hearing to start. But it could be, it could require a threat assessment to be conducted, referral to law enforcement if there are crimes being committed in schools, and a referral to the superintendent or his designee. Some of the disciplinary consequences could be recommendations for long-term suspensions, alternative placements, or even expulsion for level 5 behaviors. Does anybody have any questions about the leveling and the categories? We're going to talk about a little bit of data here in a second, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to.
Mr. Chair, if I may provide a context. Previously, before the S-bar, as Mr. Boland was mentioning, the DCV, there was very little flexibility for the administrator, and there were certain violations that the administrator's hands were tied, where they had to do a certain consequence rather than working through, as Mr. Boland mentioned, through the situation and providing those additional supports, because if you suspend a child, they are going to be back in school. And research shows suspension, whereas, yes, it might show the severity of a bad choice, it doesn't teach the student anything if there is no behavior intervention when the student returns. So with this, it now provides those levels of enforcement in regards to providing those levels of behavioral intervention and support so that we can prevent those bad choices from happening again. And we also want to make sure that this does not tie our administrators' hands from having to provide any level of consequence, especially based on what the student has done. But there was a change, a significant change, where based on what grade level that student is in, that does limit us in regards to how many days we can suspend a student. But again, we want to make sure that we are emphasizing the need for those behavioral interventions, especially at the early grades, that we're supporting and working with those students through the situation as well as with the parents. So I just want to provide that context that this is definitely a lot more advanced than where we were, and this did come through the General Assembly in regards to implementation. It was implemented during COVID, so some school divisions are still catching up with the implementation.
Thank you.
And then any questions? Yeah.
So we'll take a look at some information.
Mr. Boland.
Mr. Boland, real quick, no stranger to suspensions myself, growing up, surprise, surprise. What I have a question about is during the suspensions, are those students able to make up that work? Are they able to take homework during that time?
That's a great question, and actually the Commonwealth has recently passed laws that require school divisions to, at a minimum, correct me if I'm wrong, provide access to graded work through some platform while students are suspended. So to answer your question, absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah, I remember taking those zeros and having to catch up.
Yeah, I've been in Frederick County for 20 years, and I'm not sure exactly when that switch happened, but I do know that it's been quite a long time in Frederick County since we didn't give students access to, at least the ability to make up the work. I can tell you as a former building level administrator, we did spend time when kids were suspended making sure that we were gathering things to get to the families so they can stay caught up. Students also have access in that immediate up to 10 days suspension period, access to their teachers via email. Some teachers, if they're comfortable, can even do like video chats through Google if they choose to do so to keep up with kids. But typically their services and their access to that graded work is provided via Google Classroom.
I definitely appreciate the flexibility that the SBAR gives, because a lot of times, kids get suspended and they kind of just give up, and we definitely don't want that to happen within our community. So I'm liking the steps that I'm hearing.
To echo what Dr. Hummer said, there is no data that shows that just a suspension works to fix much of anything. Sometimes they are necessary, but we do want to pair that with instructional initiatives and instructional support so that they can stay up and stay current in their class. So when they do return, we don't have that gap to fill. Because I can tell you as an old classroom teacher, when that kid comes back after 10 or 15 days or takes suspension out, kid's sick with mono, he comes back after 6 weeks. It's very challenging to work with them to get them caught up. So we want, during that period of suspension, for them to have access to that.
Question for you, and I'm talking on a broad sense because I know every situation is different, but in general, are our students that have behavioral issues taking us up on those resources when they're outside of school to stay up with their work? I know there's going to be kids that don't do anything, but as a whole, are they taking us up, and are the parents as a whole receptive of those resources, and are they being proactive with their children?
We do have certain situations where students do a great job keeping up during their time of suspension, and we have situations where they don't. It's something that we need to look at to be able to answer that question accurately. I don't have that information in front of me, but I do know that I do typically, when I conduct a hearing, and that's typically at the end of a 10-day suspension, one of the questions that I ask is how are they staying up? And I would say about half the time that the students and parents are indicating that they are staying up with their work. That's, again, don't quote me on the habit. And there are times when they just look at me and they say, no, we don't. We do still have issues with, internet connections and things like that. So we are asking our administrators to kind of identify that ahead of time and see what we can do to kind of fix that gap. But it's not always a foolproof plan in a sense.
Thank you.
So I just provided you guys with a little bit of information regarding each of those categories and what we're seeing as the most prevalent behavioral issues within each category. So in the first one, the BAP, the behaviors that impede academic progress, typically what we're seeing is that unexcused tardiness to school and class, tend to be the biggest issues and the biggest infractions within that category, as well as interfering with learning in the classroom. So in that sense, that's what we're, you know, like I said, within each category, we're going to identify just a few areas that we're seeing the most, I wouldn't say problematic behavior, but the most issues. In regards to the relationship behaviors on the next slide, typically what we're seeing as our most is speaking in discourteous manners, using profane language, and unwanted physical contact in that category tend to be the three things that we're seeing the most in Frederick County. In our behaviors that are related to school are the behaviors that are cause safety concerns. The areas where we're seeing the most in that area are shoving, pushing, and striking students, endangering safety on the bus, and distracting the bus driver tend to be the most prevalent within that category. In the next category, the behaviors that endanger the self or others, refusal to comply with requests, not going to class, tend to be the biggest areas, the infractions in that area. And then if you look at the last one, the persistently dangerous category, 75% of those were illegal possession of a controlled substance, and we did have one issue last year. Again, this is data from last year where a student possessed a shotgun. And so that was 4 incidents out of the entire, and if you look at the next slide, it's going to provide you with kind of the information, the percentage-wise on how they break down percentage of each category, and then the raw numbers of events in each of those categories. So you do see the potentially dangerous is very, very small, but very significant at 4. So that's a brief snapshot of the process. Now, I will say that one of the areas that we are working on through the task force that Dr. Hummer has created for us is to making sure that we are, when we incorporate the SBAR, the big goal of that is to make sure that we're being consistent across buildings, because one thing that we do notice sometimes is how they may handle a disciplinary issue that's very similar at one school. It might be handled differently at another. Now, we do want our administrators to have the ability to work and with families and do what's best for kids, but we do want to be as consistent as we possibly can from school to school as the way we administer our discipline.
So under SBAR, we had 7,725 reported
So
incidents.
that is extrapolated data based on primary offense code. So in any given event, so any given disciplinary infraction, we may have up to 3, possibly 4 event codes used. Typically,
Okay.
the primary event code is where your disciplinary infraction was assigned. That's what you're looking at here. So let's take, for example, that a student may have assaulted somebody. So the primary code would be assault and battery. But there might be a secondary code because the kid cussed out the teacher as well. Mm-hmm. And so that is listed as an offense, as a violation of the code of conduct, but it may not have been disciplined because you're disciplining the primary infraction. So we've took out all those secondary and tertiary infractions and listed the primary infractions for this data, because, so previously we were required to report to the state as well, all of it. This year we will be able to report based on primary, secondary, tertiary, which will clean up our information. So I do know that sometimes it looks like there's all these events that are happening, thousands and thousands, but it's not necessarily true because we didn't have the ability to extrapolate that from primary, secondary, tertiary.
I got you.
Okay.
You have any questions, Mr. Atkins?
Good to go. I appreciate
Mrs.
it.
White, do you have any other questions?
No questions for me. Thank you.
No.
I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bowen.
Madam Chair, committee members, and Dr. Hummer. I'd like to start with the Virginia Gifted Regulations state that a school division may require a gifted advisory committee. I've been in gifted education directly for 20 years, and we've always had a gifted advisory committee here in Frederick County. So you'll see that there are 2 primary responsibilities. One is to review annually the local plan, and the second is to determine the extent to which the plan was implemented. Each year, we meet 4 times. At the first meeting, we go over all the documents that guide gifted education in Virginia and Frederick County. So there's Virginia Code, the gifted regulations, our local plan, and that advisory committee also has bylaws. And this past year, 22-23, our focus was on determination of services. So for the second meeting of the year, we focused on school-based services for academic and art. And we did a student panel and brought students in to talk about their experiences. So we had a discovery student, that's our elementary K-5 program. We had a GEMS student, that's our 6th grade program. GEMS is gifted education in middle school. We had our PRISMS student, which is problem-solving research and independent study in middle school. That's for our 7th and 8th graders. Our GIS, gifted independent study, our 11th and 12th graders. Those are our academic programs that students can access every day during the school day. In art, we have elementary gifted art for our 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. We have SART 6, which is Select Art for our 6th graders. And then we have Select Art Foundations and Select Art Studio. And those are 7th, 8th grade. Some of our students take both in 7th grade. Some take both in 8th grade. Some take Foundations in 7 and Studio for 3 times. Those students are really serious about art. At the next meeting, 3rd meeting, we focused on services and programs outside of the school day. And those would be our governor's school programs. We participate in 4 governor's school programs. Braggs, which is our Blue Ridge Regional Environmental Governor's School for our rising 6th through 9th graders. That's a 2-week program, environmental program. Again, we had a student panel. So we had a student from Braggs. Pavan, Performing and Visual Arts Northwest, is another 2-week program for our high school students, rising 9 through 12. And that focuses on the arts of visual art, guitar, vocal music, and theater. Students also have the opportunity to apply for Summer Residential Governor's School, and that's a month on a college campus, typically the month of July. And there is a wide range of options there. They're academic, they're mentorship, they're the visual and performing arts, world languages. They have a lot to choose from. And finally, we have Mountain Vista Governor's School, which is our academic year governor's school. It's a governor's school, but the students do access that during the school day. So listening to the students talk about their experiences was amazing. I mean, anytime you get kids to talk. So the second part is to determine the extent to which the plan was implemented. The committee makes some recommendations each year. And they have, for 22-23, there are 5 recommendations. Their first one, based on the standards of quality, Standard 2, which says that we should employ a minimum number of licensed full-time equivalent instructional personnel for each 1,000 students in average daily membership as set forth in the Appropriation Act. In Frederick County, that would be 14 gifted resource teachers for the division. We currently have 7. And I know Dr. Hummer is working with me and staff to see what we can do to build that up, because it's needed. Their second recommendation was that gifted services should be consistently offered across the division, especially at the middle school level, and should meet the requirements approved by our local plan. The middle school schedules at the 4 middle schools are all very different. And when you have a teacher that has to travel from Frederick County Middle to Jameswood Middle or Aylard to Byrd, it really gets wonky. The committee members also recommended expanding the Gifted Advisory Committee for advocacy and to add a school board member, a secondary gifted learner, and school administrators. So we'll be doing that for this year. They also recommended support and time to work with gifted visual arts students. The concern there is they have a class period to work with their gifted visual arts students, but many times it's 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, or 3rd and 4th together, or 4th and 5th. And the evaluation process at the elementary level, there's not a lot of time for that evaluation process. And and they wanted to highlight the mental health challenges of gifted learners and the positive impact that gifted services provide for our gifted learners. Questions?
Mr. Atkins, do you have any? Mrs. White, do you have any questions?
No, I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for all you do.
Thank you.
Okay, two more items. The first item is just an update on the calendar committee. We've met multiple times. It's comprised of principals, teachers, and parents, as well as central office staff. We had a meeting just last night, actually, where we, I think, reasonably finalized a pretty strong calendar. We're certainly very, very close anyways, and have received very positive feedback. And I want to compliment Mr. Goodwin, who's led that process, and this is his first time, to my knowledge, leading a process to develop a calendar. And I will say that not only has the conversation been really good and a lot of very, very healthy discussion, but not directly to me, but I overheard a couple of the committee members leaving yesterday saying they felt very heard and very respected through the process. So I just want to compliment Mr. Goodwin for his leadership on the calendar. So we anticipate having a recommendation for you at probably the next school board meeting, not the special called meeting, but the one after that.
And Mr. Chair, if I may, keep in mind that this calendar is posted on the website, and I've also included it in the weekly. So if you want to take a look at that and provide any feedback prior to that meeting so it's not such a surprise, I would encourage you to take a look at that, and we'll continue to share that with you. Thank you.
Any questions on the calendar? Okay. And the final item is just, this is the one action item, and the program of studies for the 24-25 school year. There are really no changes at all at the middle school level. There are no substantial changes in general to it, with the exception of the addition of one course at the high school level. I've provided a link there to the program of studies for you to be able to click on that link and review all of it. But the only new thing is the thing I'm going to go over here in a second. The other piece of that is, if you don't click on the link, this is the path to getting to it. You go to our website about departments, instructional services, and course descriptions. And Dr. Hummer and I have had conversations about how to strengthen probably our presence of our program of studies. So we're going to be working on that through this year, and for next year, we'll be bringing that forward in a different way. But the one change at the high school level is just to add programming and advanced programming. This is a new course. It'll be a prerequisite course for anybody interested in taking the computer science class, and definitely a need for this, student interest and local industry interest as well. It will not have a budget impact because this will just be taught by an existing staff member who's reducing a section probably of computer science in order to pick up the prerequisite class or something along those lines, and principals will work that out. So that's the one and only change.
Programming's huge these days.
Yeah.
Everybody needs it.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
You will see, just as a preview in the weekly update, that we did have some teachers who are English teachers who are part of the Code VA grant learning about coding. So that's pretty cool that we have English teachers learning about coding and working with a program that will help students learn how to code.
Wonderful.
So,
well, thank you very much.
any questions about the program of studies?
Do you have any questions?
None.
All right.
Mrs. White, do you have any questions?
No, no questions.
Okay, thanks.
So the recap, obviously, we went through school accreditation at a very high level, discipline data and process, and I thank Mr. Bolin, who had to run out because of an event that's happening in the elementary school with his daughter. Gifted Advisory Committee report, and of course the calendar and program of studies, the only action item being the program of studies.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
With that, I'd like to make a recommendation that we move forward to the full board to approve the 2024-2025 program of studies.
Second.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay. With that said, is there anything else?
Ms. White, you have anything else?
No.
With that, I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
Aye.